"Get out of here before I call security, you useless girl." The words of the manager echoed through the main dining room of the Golden Horizon, cutting through the ambient noise like a gunshot in a quiet cathedral. Silverware paused mid-air, conversations died instantly, and dozens of wealthy patrons turned their eyes toward the center of the room. There, a 23-year-old waitress stood with her back perfectly straight and her chin held high, while a puddle of hot coffee slowly expanded across the cream-colored marble floor of the most exclusive restaurant in Beverly Hills. Victoria Cole was not crying, and that was precisely what irritated Richard Sterling the most. The manager of the Golden Horizon had spent 12 years building a reputation as an inflexible, meticulous man, entirely incapable of tolerating the absolute slightest error within his pristine establishment. He stood exactly 6 feet tall, always wore the same navy blue suit that he had professionally pressed twice a week, and had perfected the dark art of humiliating his employees with a polite smile that his superiors interpreted as authority and his subordinates recognized as pure, unadulterated cruelty. Richard Sterling practically never raised his voice in front of the esteemed clients, considering himself far too professional for such vulgarity, except for today. Today, Victoria Cole had committed the unforgivable, mortal sin of abandoning her high-paying tables to help a poor elderly man. The entire ordeal had actually commenced precisely 40 minutes earlier, when Mr. Edward Carter, 81 years old, possessing arthritic hands, and the slow, shuffling walk of someone carrying the weight of a tremendously difficult life upon his fragile shoulders, had arrived at the restaurant, accompanied by his devoted daughter. Victoria had attended to them from the very first moment, with the exact same level of meticulous care and attention that she dedicated to any other diner. Completely ignoring the simple worn clothing they both wore, and the anxious way the daughter looked at the menu with eyes slightly widened at the exorbitant prices. That specific type of panicked gaze was something Victoria recognized intimately. It was the unmistakable look of someone who had saved for many long months just to afford a fleeting luxury that the rest of the room considered a mundane, everyday occurrence. There was something profoundly touching about Mr. Edward that sharply reminded Victoria of her own late grandfather, especially the way he requested items with an almost antiquated, gentle courtesy, treating every single word spoken as if it were a precious gift. He had carefully placed the linen napkin over his trembling knees with a certain retained elegance, and Victoria had happily brought him his warm coffee with milk and his sweet pastry. However, when the elderly man attempted to reach for the sugar bowl positioned at the far end of the heavy oak table, his elbow accidentally struck the ceramic cup, and the disaster unfolded in less than 2 seconds. The heavy cup toppled, spilling scalding coffee over the pristine white tablecloth, soaking Mr. Edward's trousers and splashing onto the upholstered edge of the expensive chair. The old man let out a small, startled gasp of pain, and Victoria was immediately at his side before anyone else in the dining room even possessed the reflex to react. Clutching a clean linen towel in her hand, she crouched down to rapidly check if Mr. Edward was injured, asking him with genuine, heartfelt concern if the scalding liquid had burned his fragile skin. "I am completely fine, my child. I am fine," the grateful old man had murmured with that helpless, beautiful tenderness that the elderly display when someone finally treats them with basic human dignity, assuring her it was merely a sudden fright. Victoria had swiftly and gracefully changed the ruined tablecloth, brought him a fresh, complimentary coffee, without a moment of hesitation, and offered a warm apology, accompanied by a smile that held absolutely nothing fake or manufactured. The daughter of Mr. Edward had reached out gently, grasped Victoria's hand, and whispered her deepest, most sincere thanks in that specific, profound way people use when regular words feel entirely insufficient to express their immense gratitude. And that was the exact moment Richard Sterling dramatically appeared, having observed the entire compassionate scene from the bustling kitchen entrance with a tightly clenched jaw and cold eyes entirely fixated on the wet linen and the unauthorized complimentary beverage. In the 20 minutes that Victoria had compassionately invested in attending to that specific table, she theoretically should have been aggressively turning over 3 other highly profitable tables. The manager's rigid calculations fundamentally did not include human compassion. They strictly included turnaround times, average consumption per table, and maximum profit margins per shift. And the modest table of Mr. Edward Carter was disastrously ruining every single one of his daily metrics. He coldly waited for the elderly man's daughter to excuse herself to the restroom, deliberately biding his time until the expansive dining room was not just mostly full, but completely packed to maximum capacity, with every single table occupied and dozens of elite conversations acting as his captive witnesses. Then he aggressively approached Victoria with slow, highly deliberate steps, embodying the terrifying posture of a predator who knows exactly how he is about to publicly execute his prey. "Miss Cole," he stated with that horribly smooth velvet voice he exclusively utilized to carefully wrap his toxic venom, "could you please explain to me exactly what this pathetic table is doing in these disastrous conditions during our peak operational hours?" Victoria looked directly into his cold eyes without even blinking, calmly explaining that the gentleman had accidentally spilled his coffee, and she had simply changed the linen and provided a replacement beverage at no cost, exactly as the fundamental protocols of basic customer service implicitly suggested. Sterling immediately interrupted her, raising his voice just a fraction of a tone, aggressively stating that the protocol certainly did not indicate she should abandon 3 high-rotation, wealthy tables to play the role of a charity nurse for a worthless client who so clearly did not fit the exclusive profile of their luxury establishment. The dining room did not halt its noise all at once. Rather, it stopped table by table, rippling outward, exactly like a heavy stone violently dropped into the center of a quiet lake, until a suffocating, deeply uncomfortable silence enveloped the entire room. "This gentleman is a paying client of this restaurant." Victoria responded with an unwavering calmness that clearly cost her a tremendous amount of internal strength, heavily emphasizing that he fundamentally deserved the exact same level of respect and attention as any other millionaire currently sitting in the room. This gentleman Sterling hissed, his voice, entirely stripped of its deceptive velvet texture, is a massive problem, and you, Miss Cole, have been a persistent problem for several consecutive weeks with your excessive time spent on low-consumption tables, your unauthorized courtesies, and your relentless personal initiatives that absolutely no one requested. I was simply doing my job to the best of my ability," Victoria stated firmly, refusing to break eye contact or show the immense fear bubbling in her chest. "Your job," Sterling repeated slowly, sadistically, savoring every single syllable, like a man enjoying a long-awaited, deeply personal vengeance officially ended today. "You are entirely fired, so collect your pathetic belongings, surrender your uniform, and vacate these private premises before I forcibly have security drag you out." The devastating silence that immediately followed was the specific suffocating type of silence that carries immense physical weight, as Mr. Edward opened his mouth in shock, but failed to articulate a single word, while at the adjacent table, a wealthy middle-aged woman dropped her silver fork onto her china plate with a loud clatter that resonated terribly. Victoria intentionally did not respond to the cruel provocation, consciously taking exactly 3 slow, deliberate seconds to gather her shattered pride, while Sterling arrogantly counted them in his head before she offered a very slight, incredibly dignified nod of her head. She calmly walked to the small, cramped employee locker, situated behind the main bar, carefully retrieved her dark brown, slightly worn handbag, silently packed her mobile phone and her apartment keys, and slowly unfastened her apron with precise, methodical movements, adamantly refusing to display any outward sign that her entire world was violently collapsing. Because internally, her world was indeed shattering into 1,000 pieces. She had spent 18 agonizing months working at the Golden Horizon, rising at 5 o'clock in the morning to reliably commute from the working-class neighborhoods of Riverside, dutifully working double shifts when her colleagues faked illnesses, and desperately sending half her wages home to her beloved mother, Clara. Clara Cole was fiercely battling a severe case of diabetes that was unfortunately advancing far more rapidly than the meager family savings could manage, and Victoria had endured 18 months of smiling through burning feet and condescending clients entirely for the sake of survival, only to lose everything today for simply helping an elderly man. She bravely crossed the expansive dining room with her bag pressed tightly against her side, and her vision firmly locked on the heavy glass doors, taking precisely 18 steps, refusing to look at Sterling, refusing to look at the heartbroken Mr. Edward, and refusing to acknowledge the wealthy diners who watched her with a nauseating mixture of pity and relief. She was exactly 3 steps away from the main exit when the heavy polished glass doors smoothly glided open from the outside, and Arthur Montgomery powerfully entered the tense atmosphere of the restaurant. First to enter was his personal assistant, an impeccably composed young man of perhaps 28 years, wearing a sharp gray suit and a highly discreet earpiece in his right ear, holding the heavy door open with both hands, and an expression of total professional neutrality. Then came the wheelchair, an incredibly modern, sleek black electric model that moved with the absolute silence of a hidden threat that fundamentally never needs to announce its terrifying presence. Seated within it, possessing the perfectly straight back of a powerful leader who had absolutely never forgotten how to command an empire, even though his lower body no longer obeyed him, was a 68-year-old billionaire with entirely stark white hair and incredibly dark, alert eyes hidden behind thin-rimmed glasses. Arthur Montgomery had been paralyzed from the waist down for exactly 10 years, 2 months, and 16 days, and for those exact same 10 years, he had reliably remained one of the top 3 wealthiest and most feared corporate titans in the entire United States. He had spent the previous 45 seconds quietly observing the entire humiliating execution of the young waitress from the shadowy threshold of the entrance, his sharp eyes evaluating the unbelievable cruelty of the manager with the exact same surgical coldness he typically applied to hostile corporate takeovers. His dark, unblinking eyes tracked Victoria Cole from the very instant she proudly marched into his direct field of vision, watching her confidently retrieve her worn handbag, powerfully stride across the silent room, and briefly falter only when her determined eyes unexpectedly locked directly onto his own calculating gaze. And in that fleeting electric moment, Arthur Montgomery executed an action that his loyal assistant Ethan had patiently waited a full 10 years to witness again in public. He slightly inclined his distinguished head toward the young man in the gray suit, and without ever breaking his intense visual connection with Victoria, he spoke in an incredibly low, quiet voice that carried the absolute terrifying tranquility of a man who historically never had to repeat a single command. "Stop her immediately," he ordered, and Victoria abruptly felt a firm, respectful hand gently touch her shoulder before she even registered the polite voice of the young assistant requesting her to pause for a brief moment. She stopped her forward momentum not out of any inherent fear or automatic obedience to wealth, but simply because something in the highly trained professional calmness of Ethan's voice clearly indicated that this polite request was absolutely not a mere suggestion. Turning around, she faced the young assistant who physically occupied exactly the necessary amount of space required to project authority watching, as he gracefully extended a premium minimalist business card held delicately between two fingers, stating quietly that Mr. Montgomery intensely desired a private word with her. Victoria closely examined the pristine card, which simply read, Montgomery Holdings. Arthur Montgomery, Chief Executive Officer, presented in stark black typography on a pure white background without a single ostentatious decoration, confirming her street-smart theory that individuals who genuinely possess limitless wealth practically never feel the pathetic need to visually decorate their powerful names. She cautiously looked over at the imposing Arthur, noting that he was actively studying her. Absolutely not, with the deeply condescending invisible gaze that wealthy clients typically reserved for members of the service industry, but rather with a profound, piercing curiosity. He was looking at her exactly how a brilliant mathematician looks at a highly unexpected variable that fundamentally breaks a complex equation, a variable that is infinitely more fascinating than all the boring numbers that obediently fit into their designated predictable places. Victoria Cole had spent her entire youth mastering the vital survival skill of rapidly reading human gazes, understanding the subtle differences between a client who genuinely respected her and one who merely tolerated her existence. The intense gaze of Arthur Montgomery held absolutely zero pity. Instead, it possessed a raw, genuine curiosity, and Victoria, who had honestly expected absolutely nothing positive to occur on this disastrous day, took precisely 2 seconds to logically conclude that she had absolutely nothing left to lose. She smoothly tucked the expensive card into the pocket of her worn bag and confidently walked directly toward the electric wheelchair, meeting the billionaire on his own terms. Arthur deliberately did not extend his hand in greeting, absolutely not out of any inherent rudeness, but simply because his hands, though he could move them somewhat freely, remained resting firmly on the armrests to conserve his limited physical energy for matters of true importance. He politely greeted her with a very slight, deeply dignified nod of his head that easily contained far more genuine respect than the vast majority of the aggressive handshakes Victoria had been forced to endure throughout her incredibly challenging life. Miss, he began, his voice surprisingly deep and measured, possessing the rare commanding quality that fundamentally never requires increased volume to completely dominate a physical space. I saw exactly what just transpired in there. The entire restaurant saw exactly what happened. Victoria boldly replied with a sharp edge to her voice, immediately regretting her defensive tone and softly adding an apology, explaining that it had been a tremendously difficult and exhausting day. The old man's lips barely curved into a subtle expression that wasn't exactly a full smile, but rather the rare appreciative gesture of a powerful leader who easily recognizes raw honesty and deeply respects it enough to not pretend he was offended. "How long had you been tirelessly working in this establishment?" he asked, smoothly transitioning into an interrogation that felt surprisingly natural, prompting Victoria to reveal her 18 months of service, her previous 2 years, at a chaotic hotel in downtown Los Angeles, and her 6 months at a busy coffee shop while completing her arduous university studies. "What specific degree did you earn?" Arthur pressed his dark eyes, sharpening with intense focus, when Victoria proudly stated she held a degree in business administration from the University of California, Los Angeles, graduating in the top percentile. Something monumental shifted deep within the old man's eyes, a subtle, almost imperceptible click, entirely resembling the satisfying moment a complex key finally turns inside a heavy rusted lock. As he astutely guessed, she had attended the expensive university on a full academic scholarship. Victoria slightly furrowed her brow in genuine confusion as to how he could possibly know such an intimate detail, confirming that she indeed held a full scholarship and had graduated with a flawless 4.0 grade point average, despite working terrible hours to survive. Arthur slowly nodded his head, his brilliant mind processing the incredible disparity of her situation, as Ethan remained standing a few feet away, entirely neutral and invisible, perfectly embodying the ultimate professional assistant. Why on earth is a brilliant top-tier business graduate serving hot coffee to ungrateful millionaires? Arthur asked, his tone completely stripped of judgment, representing a genuine, profound question from a man who actually listened to answers rather than merely waiting for his own turn to speak. Victoria heavily considered lying, desperately wanting to protect her vulnerable pride, with a vague, polite excuse, but she sharply remembered she had just lost her sole source of income for defending a stranger, leading her to bravely reveal the heartbreaking truth about her mother, Clara's severe diabetes. She explained that the desperately needed medical treatments cost infinitely more than their basic insurance covered, and her entry-level corporate salary as a recent graduate simply could not bridge the massive financial gap, forcing her to rely on the lucrative immediate cash tips of high-end waitressing to keep her beloved family alive. Arthur maintained a profound, heavy silence for a long moment, while the chaotic afternoon traffic of Los Angeles continued its indifferent, noisy flow just outside the glass doors, deeply contrasting the life-altering moment occurring on the pavement. "I have a highly unconventional proposal," Arthur finally stated, offering her a position as his personal events coordinator and schedule manager, a demanding role requiring erratic hours and dealing with his famously difficult, highly toxic family. However, the base salary would completely triple what she earned here, featuring comprehensive executive benefits and, most importantly, a premium family medical insurance plan that would entirely cover every single one of her mother's incredibly expensive treatments without question. The terrified, exhausted heart of Victoria Cole skipped a dramatic beat as those miraculous words landed heavily upon her chest, prompting her to bravely ask the billionaire exactly why he was offering this unbelievable lifeline to a complete stranger. "Because I watched incredibly closely how you behaved when you genuinely believed that absolutely nobody important was looking," Arthur answered with absolute piercing honesty, a reason that convinced Victoria to cautiously accept the small contact card from Ethan stepping out into the warm California sun with a terrifying, beautiful spark of sudden hope. The sprawling Montgomery estate, located deep within the ultra-exclusive hills of Bel Air, was absolutely nothing like the sterile, intimidating environment Victoria had nervously imagined during her sleepless night in her small apartment. She had fully anticipated discovering a freezing, soulless fortress, constructed of blinding white marble, featuring endless corridors resembling corporate airport terminals, staffed by terrified servants who marched in perfectly straight lines and rigidly refused to ever lift their submissive eyes. She had expected to step into the exact type of unlivable, perfectly symmetrical, entirely artificial home that was constantly featured in the glossy architectural magazines the wealthy clients at the restaurant casually left behind on their tables. What she actually found, when Arthur's sleek black corporate vehicle smoothly stopped in front of the massive wrought iron gates at exactly 15 minutes past 9 in the morning, was profoundly, surprisingly different. The expansive mansion was undeniably massive, boasting 4 distinct levels and incredibly lush gardens that wildly extended outward, as if the incredibly vast property genuinely did not know where its borders were supposed to legally terminate. Yet, there was an undeniably organic, welcoming quality to its historic architecture, powerfully suggesting that it had been lovingly built by a visionary who actually intended to live fully within its walls, rather than a narcissist merely seeking to constantly impress jealous outsiders. The towering windows were wide and inviting, and the sprawling rear gardens prominently featured ancient twisted trees that no modern pretentious landscape designer would ever willingly select, because they were far too beautifully irregular and entirely too real. A massive, vibrant purple bougainvillea violently climbed the entire northern stone wall with the absolute, glorious insolence of a living entity that had been comfortably installed there for several decades and intimately knew that absolutely nobody possessed the power to ever remove it. Ethan, the ever-professional assistant, was patiently waiting for her at the grand entrance, smoothly informing her that Mr. Montgomery was locked in an intense corporate meeting until exactly 11 o'clock, and had specifically instructed him to provide a comprehensive tour of the facilities. He noted that he was to thoroughly explain the complex parameters of her new position before officially introducing her to the notoriously difficult remainder of the Montgomery family, a prospect that Ethan announced with a carefully guarded hesitation. Victoria astutely looked directly at the young assistant, asking point-blank if there was crucial survival information she desperately needed to comprehend before meeting these mysterious relatives, sensing the deep, unspoken warning perfectly hidden within his calm demeanor. Ethan paused for precisely 1 second, choosing his next words with the absolute terrifying care of an expert diplomat navigating a deadly minefield, plainly stating that the Montgomery family was incredibly complex and deeply fractured. The very first relative she unfortunately encountered without any formal introduction whatsoever was Robert Montgomery, Jr., who was aggressively descending the grand main staircase at the exact moment Victoria and Ethan crossed the massive central vestibule. He was 39 years old, sharing his father's imposing height, but entirely lacking his father's terrifying absolute stillness, projecting instead the chaotic, dangerous impatience of an arrogant man who knows massive generational wealth will eventually be his. He was dressed in ridiculously expensive designer athletic wear, confidently sporting a gray training pant and a black Italian hoodie that Victoria instantly recognized because the most arrogant, demanding clients at the restaurant frequently wore that exact brand to project casual superiority. His dark hair was slightly damp, indicating he had just finished an intense workout in the massive private gymnasium that Ethan had previously mentioned occupied the entire northern wing of the sprawling third floor. Robert Jr. stopped abruptly on the stairs, staring at Victoria from top to bottom with the exact same nauseating entitlement he would use to inspect a newly purchased, slightly defective piece of living room furniture. The new girl, he stated rudely to Ethan, pointing at Victoria with a dismissive jerk of his head, intentionally treating her as if she were either completely deaf or simply unworthy of being addressed as a fellow human being. "Victoria Cole, the new personal coordinator," Ethan replied smoothly, maintaining his perfect neutrality, while Robert Jr. coldly stated he knew her job title, but furiously demanded to know exactly who had authorized her bizarre hiring. "Your father made the decision," Victoria interjected calmly, stepping directly into the line of fire, because she perfectly understood Ethan's strategic silence was a deliberate invitation for her to establish her own boundaries immediately. Robert Jr.'s eyes violently snapped toward her, losing all traces of casual boredom, and instantly sharpening into the predatory, hateful glare of a deeply paranoid man who feels his precious territory is being actively invaded. "My father," he sneered, making the two words sound simultaneously like a bitter complaint and a violent threat, "has a terrible habit of making erratic decisions without consulting anyone, especially decisions that infect this private home." "I understand," Victoria replied, without a single ounce of intimidation, prompting Robert to aggressively cross his muscular arms and rudely ask exactly how long she had supposedly known his incredibly wealthy father. "Less than a single day," Victoria answered with devastating honesty, firmly adding that the brief duration of their acquaintance absolutely did not change the ironclad conditions of the generous employment contract he had legally offered her. Robert Jr. let out a sharp, breathless sound that entirely failed to qualify as a genuine laugh, bitterly wishing her good luck before angrily storming off toward the massive kitchen, leaving Victoria to quietly ask Ethan if the son was always this aggressively hostile. Today, he was actually surprisingly cordial. Ethan replied with his signature deadpan expression, smoothly guiding her up to the luxurious second level, where she unfortunately met Catherine Roberts' deeply calculating 36-year-old wife. Catherine possessed the exact type of incredibly expensive, high-maintenance beauty that requires limitless financial resources to constantly uphold, featuring perfectly highlighted dark hair, an immaculate manicure, and casual clothing that secretly cost more than Victoria previously earned in an entire year. Catherine was comfortably seated in the upper lounge, aggressively typing on a sleek laptop with a cup of green tea, and greeted Victoria with a terrifyingly fake, utterly lifeless smile, condescendingly calling her the little waitressing girl from the restaurant. Victoria firmly extended her hand, introducing herself properly, while Catherine barely touched her fingertips, sweetly dripping venom, as she noted how entirely bizarre it was that Arthur had completely skipped the rigorous background checks and security protocols to hire a random server off the street. That specific inquiry would have to be directed entirely to Mr. Montgomery himself, Victoria countered politely, but firmly refusing to be drawn into the toxic, passive-aggressive game that Catherine had so clearly spent her entire miserable adulthood perfecting. Ethan swiftly rescued her from the poisonous encounter, continuing the exhaustive tour by showcasing the breathtaking outdoor event terraces, the heavily guarded private corporate study, and finally, the surprisingly pleasant, compact office that would serve as Victoria's operational base. Once they were safely secluded within her new office, Ethan's professional mask slightly slipped, revealing a grave, profound seriousness as he quietly disclosed the most dangerous, highly classified secret of the Montgomery Empire. Arthur Montgomery. Ethan whispered with immense gravity, was far more critically ill than anyone outside the estate realized. The devastating spinal accident from a decade ago had recently spawned severe, terrifying cardiac complications that the doctors were struggling to control. Ethan warned Victoria that she absolutely must be prepared for sudden life-threatening medical emergencies, heavily implying that the vicious family members were actively circling like starving vultures, impatiently waiting for the patriarch's weak heart to finally fail so they could seize the massive corporate throne. During her entire first week at the sprawling Bel Air estate, Victoria Cole did not commit a single solitary error, a flawless performance that ironically made her a massive, glaring target in a deeply paranoid household where perfection was instantly viewed as an act of aggressive warfare. She successfully coordinated 3 complex high-stakes social gatherings, entirely reorganized the outdated vendor management system that had been disastrously neglected for 2 full years, and ruthlessly negotiated a stunning 17% reduction in the annual floral contract without losing a single petal of quality. Furthermore, she proactively drafted a comprehensive 4-page analytical report detailing the exact status of Mr. Montgomery's social and philanthropic commitments for the upcoming 90 days, implementing a brilliant color-coded priority matrix that absolutely nobody had requested. Arthur Montgomery read that magnificent, unsolicited document twice in complete silence, uttering absolutely nothing, but his dark, calculating eyes gleamed with the profound satisfaction of a master chess player who realizes his newest, seemingly insignificant pawn is actually a tremendously powerful queen in disguise. By the heavily tense second week, Robert Jr. actively began stalking her movements, entirely convinced she was a highly trained corporate spy deployed by his terrifying father to actively sabotage his own desperate, greedy ambitions to take over the massive holding company. Robert strategically appeared in the long, quiet corridors, with deeply suspicious frequency, aggressively inspecting the shared administrative documents, the very second Victoria stepped away from her oak desk, and constantly peppering her with thinly veiled hostile interrogations disguised as casual, friendly conversation. Victoria effortlessly deflected every single poisonous inquiry with absolute unwavering clarity and zero visible anxiety, a psychological defense mechanism she had thoroughly perfected after years of surviving the brutal, soul-crushing environment of high-end customer service. By the third week, the incredibly high stakes were dramatically elevated when Arthur summoned Victoria into his heavily guarded private study on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the golden California sunlight casting long, dramatic shadows across the dark mahogany furniture. Arthur firmly slid 3 heavily redacted, highly confidential corporate folders directly across his massive desk, revealing the incredibly complex internal financial statements of the entire Montgomery Holdings empire, covering 12 massive subsidiaries and international operations spanning 3 different countries. He ordered her to closely review the complex numbers, and within precisely 10 intense seconds, Victoria's brilliant, mathematically gifted mind effortlessly decoded the hidden, terrifying truth buried deep within the intentionally convoluted spreadsheets. The major logistics subsidiary operating out of Nevada is disastrously undercapitalized, Victoria stated with absolute fearless certainty, pointing directly to a specific column and explaining that the horrifying negative cash flow trends over the last 3 consecutive quarters would inevitably trigger a catastrophic bankruptcy by next June. Furthermore, she boldly continued without missing a single beat. This massive distribution contract in Chicago possesses highly suspicious profit margins that mathematically do not justify the massive operational volume, clearly indicating that someone internally negotiated an incredibly terrible deal, or far worse, intentionally negotiated with corrupt competing interests. A profound, incredibly heavy silence instantly descended upon the grand study as Arthur stared at her with an expression of sheer, unadulterated awe, deeply shocked that a 23-year-old former waitress had just effortlessly exposed a massive corporate vulnerability that his highly paid executives had missed. He quietly asked her exactly where she had learned to brutally dissect advanced financial statements with such terrifying precision, to which Victoria proudly revealed the heartbreaking story of her late grandfather's failed manufacturing plant in Riverside. She explained she had desperately managed his complex accounting books since she was 15 years old, desperately trying to save the honest business before a deeply corrupt, treacherous supplier had ruthlessly destroyed everything they had built. Arthur slowly nodded profoundly, understanding that the deep bleeding wounds of her painful past had forged her into an incredibly brilliant, fiercely protective weapon, immediately declaring that starting tomorrow she would attend the highest-level executive board meetings not as a silent secretary, but as a vocal, empowered observer. Victoria carefully warned him that his incredibly greedy, deeply insecure family would absolutely despise this unprecedented elevation of a mere employee. But Arthur merely let out a dry, bitter laugh, stating he had spent 68 years making unpopular decisions and absolutely did not care about their pathetic outrage. This incredibly daring promotion violently triggered the inevitable catastrophic retaliation from Catherine and Robert Jr., who immediately recognized Victoria as a lethal threat to their unearned inheritance, launching a despicable, highly coordinated plot that took exactly 11 days to fully activate. On a chaotic Monday morning, 3 absolutely vital, highly sensitive folders suddenly vanished into thin air from Arthur's securely locked study, specifically containing the original Nevada contracts and the highly confidential Chicago agreements that Victoria had recently reviewed. Victoria thoroughly searched the massive office for 40 excruciating minutes, desperately checking the secure digital backups and the physical archives before calmly reporting the disastrous theft to Arthur, who received the terrifying news with an absolute terrifying calmness. Robert Jr. conveniently appeared in the doorway seconds later with a deeply fake, entirely manufactured expression of profound concern, aggressively pointing his trembling finger directly at Victoria and loudly accusing her of being a treacherous corporate spy who had obviously stolen the critical files. The only brand-new, entirely unverified person living in this secure house is the exact same person who magically had exclusive access to those missing documents last week, Robert shouted, his face red with fake indignation, demanding her immediate arrest and termination. Victoria stood her ground, perfectly refusing to raise her voice or show an ounce of fear, calmly staring directly into Robert's lying eyes and flatly stating she had absolutely not taken a single piece of paper, demanding he produce actual, verifiable evidence before making such slanderous accusations. And in that precise, incredibly tense second before Robert could spew another toxic lie, Arthur's incredibly fragile heart finally gave out his face, violently turning a horrifying shade of pale as he gasped for air and violently collapsed forward in his electric wheelchair. Ethan was already sprinting across the massive room before anyone else even registered the medical catastrophe. But it was Victoria who instantly took absolute commanding control of the terrifying, chaotic situation. "Mr. Montgomery," she shouted clearly, forcefully, keeping the gasping billionaire conscious, while simultaneously barking rapid-fire life-saving orders at Ethan to retrieve the specific emergency cardiac injections from the left desk drawer. She violently turned toward the utterly useless paralyzed Robert Jr., ferociously ordering him to immediately get out of the room and completely clear the external hallway for the approaching paramedics, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying command that forced the arrogant son to instantly obey. For the next 17 agonizing minutes, Victoria flawlessly administered the critical medication, desperately holding Arthur's trembling hand and speaking to him in a low, fiercely calm voice, successfully stabilizing his failing heart just seconds before the elite medical team finally crashed through the front doors. The immediate aftermath of the terrifying medical emergency left the massive Bel Air mansion suffocating under a thick, oppressive blanket of profound anxiety, while Arthur Montgomery was carefully stabilized and confined to absolute strict bed rest by his frantic team of personal physicians. Victoria emerged from the chaotic medical scene feeling entirely drained, only to be immediately ambushed in the grand hallway by a deeply furious Catherine, who leaned against the expensive wallpaper with her arms aggressively crossed and a profoundly ugly, vindictive sneer warping her beautiful features. "How incredibly convenient," Catherine hissed, with pure venomous malice, that the little waitressing girl was positioned right there to play the heroic savior while simultaneously distracting everyone from the glaring, undeniable fact that millions of dollars in corporate documents are still magically missing. Victoria stopped walking, slowly turning to face the older woman with an expression so incredibly cold and terrifyingly composed that Catherine actually took an involuntary step backward, completely unnerved by the sheer unadulterated power radiating from the young woman. The stolen corporate documents are absolutely going to miraculously reappear. "Very soon," Victoria stated in a deadly hushed whisper that echoed like thunder. "And when they finally do surface, I am going to know exactly whose filthy, treacherous hands were responsible for moving them." Victoria secretly joined Ethan to review the mansion's security footage and uncovered undeniable evidence that Catherine had stolen the company documents and attempted to frame her. Ethan had already secured encrypted copies of the recordings, ensuring the evidence could not be destroyed. After watching the footage, Arthur calmly confirmed the document's location and ordered an emergency family meeting. There he exposed Catherine and Robert's betrayal, announced their eviction without compensation, and thanked Victoria for her loyalty and courage, firmly establishing her place as his trusted ally. 6 weeks later, Arthur shocked Montgomery Holdings by appointing Victoria as the new chief operating officer, giving her authority over the entire corporation after presenting her brilliant 42-page strategic plan. Despite initial skepticism from senior executives, she convincingly defended her ideas and earned their respect. Soon after she confronted Richard, the restaurant manager who had once humiliated and fired her, professionally ending his company's lucrative catering contract because of his lack of compassion. Under Victoria's leadership, the business flourished, her family's lives improved dramatically, and she realized that genuine kindness and integrity, not cruelty or deception, are the true foundations of lasting success.